Hello and welcome to Resolutions, a podcast about dispute resolution and prevention. I'm your host, Alex Green IV. Today we welcome back Katherine Connor and welcome guest Katherine Miller from the Center for Understanding and Conflict for episode number 2 of this series. I introduced you to and gave a biography for Katherine Connor from episode 1. In this episode, let's introduce Katherine Miller. Katherine Miller is an attorney practicing mediation and collaborative practice in Westchester County, New York. She has been practicing family law since 1987, first as litigator and now exclusively inside the court system. She has taught family law at the White Institute and NYU, as with the center, and lectures regularly on mediation and collaborative practice. She is a board member of the New York Association of Collaborative Professionals. Our discussion today focuses on the training and conflict resolution model at the Center for Understanding and Conflict. First, thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Alex.
Hi, Alex. Nice to see you again.
Right. Nice to see you again. So I read that, or I see that this model at the Center for Understanding and Conflict is an understanding-based approach, and it has these 6 underlying concepts, developing an understanding, letting the parties own the conflict, proceeding by agreement and going beneath the problem, allowing tension and support autonomy and honor connection. Could we just kind of give a brief explanation of what each one of these means, or even perhaps like an example of how, perhaps if you were in a training or you were giving a hypothetical or role play, what each one of these looks like in practice?
Yeah, let me start, Alex, just by telling you a little bit of a story about how these came about, because I think it's pretty interesting, which is the founders of the center and the model, Gary Friedman and Jack Himmelstein, had been teaching together and developing the model over a few years. And they were in a coffee shop in Vienna where they'd done a training. They said, we've been talking about this for a while, teaching it. Maybe we should try and come up with some underlying concepts to create a structure and that sort of principles people could work off when they're practicing. So they each literally took out a napkin and wrote down and said, well, let's do 5 each. And they wrote down 5 each. And it turned out that 4 overlapped, and then they each had 1 extra. So that's how it became 6 underlying concepts. And it's really something that for me and what we teach people is try and have these as something you live by as you're practicing, because at any moment, particularly when there's something tough, one of these principles can help you to figure out what to do, as well as just, the foundation for how we work together. So I'll talk about the first one. Maybe we just take turns with.
Okay, so for the audience, that was Katherine Connor.
Thanks, Alice. So the first one is develop understanding, which obviously for the understanding-based model would make sense that that's our first one. And what that means is that instead of using pressure, coercion, and trying to push people or scare people into reaching agreements and often the way it's done is, well, if you go to court, this terrible thing is what's going to happen, or you never know what's going to happen. And so that's how you try and push people to agreement. Instead, what we believe is that if you try and help people to understand their own views, because sometimes they don't even have clarity about what's important to them, what's important to the other person and their perspective on the situation, and the understanding of just the sort of practical reality of their situation. By doing that, you have a much better chance of coming up with an agreement that makes sense to both of them, in which they can agree and feel good about and actually carry out, rather than something they're kind of pushed into and maybe they regret, or maybe they resist even doing it once they come to their senses. So that's what develop understanding is about.
Okay. And you do see this just anecdotally, because people have, deadlines, and some of these are court connected mediations. So keeping both interests in mind, which is an efficient mediation that looks at the operative facts and perhaps even the law in certain cases. But I understand that in mediation, we're not, acting as attorneys or counsel for the parties, but sometimes attorneys are involved. How do we manage both interests? Because in a perfect world, we could develop an understanding, and whatever that understanding is fine. But in a court case, right, there may be certain things that may have to be done in a certain way. So how do we balance that? This is Katherine Connor.
Mhm. So, initially, whenever I start a mediation, after we go through just, having a conversation about how it's going to work, I always ask, and even if it's one where, maybe it's a 3-hour settlement conference that people are mandated to go through court and I'm there volunteering, I always ask, is there information that you need that would help you to be able to say yes in the end? And so many times, even with lawyers involved, there's a very key missing piece of information. So that's the practical reality point. And if people don't have it, they're just going to say no. So you actually end up spending more time if you don't have that information, because people say, no, well, why no? Eventually it comes out, oh, well, I need this piece of information. With respect to understanding what's important to people, again, even if I do a short one where, court is, a trial is pending, if you can spend even, half an hour talking to people about what's important about the solution, what is it that's going to make a difference for you in your life, you have a much better chance, again, of coming to agreement where they feel like they can say yes, because if it's not going to work for them, they're more likely to say no. And so that's just a basic part of every mediation or any kind of conflict resolution that I do, is finding that out. Because otherwise, you could take a lot longer and do the pressure, but people can, I think they say yes quicker when they feel like they're being taken care of what's important to them, rather than you have to keep pushing them and eventually push them into an agreement.
Has that been your experience, Katherine Miller?
It has. And, Alex, I'd like to just add one other thing about developing understanding, which is obviously the core underlying principle. It's the big kahuna of the understanding-based model. Of course, it's to develop understanding. But one thing that I think, in my experience, is that people come into conflict not with a really full understanding of themselves. Right. And a lot of anxiety when most people hate conflict. And in fact, my belief is that most conflict resolution professionals came to the field in a counter-phobic way because they don't know what to do with conflicts. Are like, it's physician heal thyself. Like, let's find out how we can learn to deal with conflict better. And because of that anxiety, people just sort of take a position, and the position will help them stop feeling anxious about the conflict, right? And so then they stop trying to understand themselves because they're just like, well, if I got this thing, if I got the red car, then I wouldn't be anxious about it. Anyone wouldn't have to think about the blue car or the green car. Obviously I'm oversimplifying here. And one of the key tenets is that that the conflict resolution will be better served if both people take the time to understand where they themselves are coming from and why first. And so, to me, this was a absolutely paradigm shifting idea that each person, myself included, when I'm in a conflict with someone or I'm in a negotiation, to understand where I'm coming from first brings down my own anxiety, because I can understand, hey, what's up with that? Then what's up with the position that I'm taking? What's up with the feelings that I'm having? And if we can encourage people to do that, and then come back to, all right, now how am I going to figure out what's going on with you? Now I'm coming from a really different stance because I feel a lot more grounded in myself. And that, and in and of itself, makes a really big difference in how people see the conflict. So they're coming in, okay, each person has their stance and they're about it. And now we've developed the understanding, and then it shifts just a little bit, But where it seemed impossible and stuck because we were so entrenched in where we're coming from, now we understand the situation. It's maybe a little bit looser. We've shifted a degree, and now we see it a little bit differently. And that in and of itself can be really incredibly powerful.
And so the corresponding part of that is that when if they feel like they've been understood and they actually understand themselves better, they're opening to hearing and understanding the other person. And what's interesting, I think, is as we come in with anxiety ourselves, and we may be stuck to a position, we also come in with this whole story about the other person and what they think and what they want and why they did the things they did. And if we can have a conversation where I, as one party in conflict, feel understood, now I can kind of start to open up and be willing to hear the other person. There may be things I hear like, oh, I didn't realize that's why you did that. Or I didn't know that's what you wanted. I've heard that so many times when we have the conversation together in the same room and someone's listening to the other person, all of a sudden you can tell that the story they had about the other person has now changed dramatically because they've had the opportunity to actually listen to the other person.
you can't own the conflict if you don't know yourself, right? And you can't own your role in it, and maybe the party's position, right? If you don't understand who the parties are and what informs their perspectives. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking a little bit earlier about the idea that expanding understanding might seem a little counterintuitive in the moment, right? Because one of the things that is, I think, really present for us, sort of in our hard wiring as humans, is this idea of right and wrong. Well, if we're in conflict, Alex, and I'm right, well, you have to be wrong. And if you're right, well, then I have to be wrong. And
right.
Who wants to be wrong? Right. Nobody, you know. And so if we have this idea that we both have our view, and if you just separate that from right and wrong, like then it's like, wow, wait a second, you can have your view and I can have my view, and I don't have to make me right and you wrong, and I don't have to feel wrong if you're right. And if the mediator or the conflict resolution professional can hold those two ideas, Alex's view and Katherine's view, at the same time, without exploding and without having to decide, now we really have an opportunity to think about what the problem is without that idea of right and wrong, and not necessarily win and lose either, because win and lose, that's a very close cousin to right and wrong. and so that really enlarges the possibility of resolution to a place that might not be something that either party or any party in a multi-party conflict had thought about before.
Right.
And that actually ties into what you asked about, Alex, which was the parties owning the conflict, which is when they understand it better, they own the conflict. But also, as conflict professionals, we're not going to be the ones to make the decision. And we're not going to be trying to direct them into what we think is, oh, I've heard this case number 27. Let me just, guide them to saying yes to case number 27 solution because I know what's best for them. It's they now understand themselves better. They understand the situation. They're going to be living with the solution. It's their responsibility to find the right solution, not the professionals. And this is really hard. It's hard for the professionals, and it's often hard for parties because they're like, we're stuck. We're going to go to, Katherine, and she's going to tell us what to do. So we're saying to them, no, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You are going to figure out what to do with my help, but it's really your responsibility. And so as the professionals, like, oh, I don't have that burden on my shoulders of trying to figure out how to solve their problem. They actually have it. And that engages them in a very different way. And they put more energy into it, and they can come up with great ideas. When you say, I've said so many times, I don't have a magic wand here. You have ideas about what we should do here. And then you just sit. And sometimes silence can then be, oh, I have to come up with this. Actually, I have a great idea.
But make no mistake, that any listeners out there who are professionals or thinking, wait a freaking second, isn't it the mediator's job to resolve the conflict? And that's a really interesting pressure point. So what does that mean? That it's the mediator's job to resolve the conflict. And so what we're saying with this, letting the parties on the conflict, is that it's the parties' conflict. They created it, and ultimately they're going to solve it. And it's our job to help them do that, to do it. We're helping to do it by creating the opportunity, the model, the boundaries, the process for them to have those conversations, but we're not getting in front of them and making those decisions for them because we can't. Right? We might have an idea, but we're not going to go home with them and help them and sort of be there, sort of blowing the whistle wherever they are having their conflict.
Right. And
what's interesting.
Go ahead.
What's interesting is I think if you get ahead of people, so I have a solution as the conflict professional, and I just want to maybe figure out how to get them there. People can feel that, and they can feel like you're trying to draw them away from what they want and become more resistant. And actually, you can make it more difficult if you're 3 steps of where they are, and rather than being there with them, and you're kind of all going together along this path towards a resolution, but you're not pulling them along as if, they're the donkey and you're pulling them.
Right.
And they're like putting their heels
I know. It's like a reflex. If you pull me one way, I'm pulling another, like a tug of war. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess my thought is, is that one of the reasons why I know mediators are often taught they don't really, one of the things I struggle with, in mediation, learning about how to be a mediator is, well, what's the law on this? What's the, industry standard on this, right? And the mediator was a little bit more from a school of thought where, I've said a little bit more assistive and more less evaluative in terms of how she thought of conflict resolution. So, is it true that, is it difficult, for example, if you do have, because we do like to come up, especially in the world, we can't, we need some type of reference point usually for something, right? So if you hear someone say something that is just, it may be their belief, but it's a little bit far afield, right? For whatever reason, how do we guide, without not allowing the party to own the conflict and not understanding, right, the party's perspective? How do you sort of grapple with that? Because there are going to be people who kind of, and that's for Katherine Miller, there are going to be people who just are a little bit too far afield. Certain things are certainly, I'm not saying that we solve conflict in math, but like 2 + 2 is still going to be 4, right?
Right. So that's a great question. And it really, the way that you're phrasing it really basically says, what's the role of law in the mediation, right? Is law, or the mediator's opinion or the lawyer's opinion of what the likely outcome in court going to be would be if the people were in court, is that the right answer or is it not the right answer? And where does that fall? And so we believe that the law is an important part of the reality that the people face. And part of the BATNA, right, the best alternative or perhaps the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, it might well include a legal proceeding and a judge or a jury making a decision as to what the right answer is. And so the question is, can people know that, right? Know that the likely outcome in court is a range of options between A and B, and assimilate that into part of the decision-making process and make a decision together or individually how much importance that should have. It kind of goes back to the letting the parties own the conflict also, because when the mediator is like, well, the right result is what I think would happen if we were in court, right? If that's the right result, and if you guys are not going to be like in that range of possibility, then you're not doing it right, and so it's a lot, in some ways, easier to do it that way and say, okay, the right result falls in this frame. And, if you go back to Rubenstein and Ure, Getting to Yes, like one of the original books on interest-based negotiation, where all this sort of stems from, they talk about this idea of objective criteria. And in some ways, and I sort of, I think that the objective criteria, the reliance on objective criteria, to the extent you can say that the law is objective, right? Because I'm not so sure that it is. Like, the reliance on that, if you say that's, that's a way to kind of keep people in bounds. But, I think what you're asking about, Alex, is when people are sort of really kind of out of bounds, what, and I think that, I still think, and Katherine, Connor, I think you agree, that it's best to keep them talking about what works for them, but to have this idea that there is an exterior reality. There is an outside world that if they cannot resolve this dispute in this negotiation, whether or not it's mediation or some out-of-court resolution, then what are they going to do? And I think that it's useful, and the model calls for them knowing that, right? And then making a decision about whether or not they're willing to stay in this process and work on a resolution that makes sense for them based on their knowledge of the external reality, including the law, because it's not just that, it's the finances of the situation, it's contracts that might be involved, it's prior agreements. There's a whole lot of stuff out there that's important to them that might not be right in the room with us.
Right.
And let me just add one more thing, which is something you mentioned, Alex, which is, there's societal standards. And does that come into play? And when I'm talking about the law or if there's lawyers involved, having them talk about the law, I think it's really important for the parties to understand, why is the law the way it is? So are there some underlying principles for a particular law and why it's being applied in the way it would in their case? Because then they get to decide, oh, well, those principles actually make sense for our situation, or those principles or standards actually don't apply to our situation, and it makes it more sense to do something different from the law. But then they get to decide that by understanding kind of what's under the hood, rather than just telling them this is the law and the way it is,
Right.
and not understanding why.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a problem that a lot of lawyers, mediators are not have. We're sort of talking the secret language about with legal terms and not translating what that secret language means. It can be really scary for people who don't speak that language.
Right. And towards this, do you think the model prefers conflicts that aren't court connected or before they get to a court process? And do you think it prefers just having the parties and not counsel with the parties? It would seem it would be easier without, I'm not to say that those aren't important, but it sounds like you're really trying to get at who the disputants are.
The model applies to basically any situation where people are in conflict. So that could be, we've done trainings with people that are doing workplace mediation. So, and they're not going to be going to court, but they're going to be working together with each other, and they have a conflict. Maybe it's a manager and a direct report, and they need to work through it. It applies in group situations that aren't necessarily something to go to court. Maybe it's a nonprofit organization that's having staff conflicts. Maybe it's between two neighborhood groups.
Right.
So is there a situation where you could work through, by understanding, as we said, the parties with their views, the situation, and then brainstorm possibilities and put it all together? This model can apply to those. With respect to lawyers in the room or not in the room, it's fine either way. I think that sometimes people want to just be with the mediator and not have lawyers in the room because that feels either more intimidating or they feel like they don't need them. That's fine, we can do it. And sometimes people want lawyers in the room. It makes them feel protective, and actually they feel freer to say things or to agree because they know someone's got their back sitting there with them. Lawyers can come up with great ideas. They've done, especially if it's in a particular area where they specialize, they may have had many, other things that work out, so they can come up with creative ideas. So it's not that it's better to have lawyers in the room or not. It's just whatever the parties want to have.
And before I ask you to weigh in, Katherine Miller, I want to rephrase it a little bit better. If you don't have the strictures of, okay, there is a court case pending, right? And we, or have to go before a judge or a jury or whatnot, doesn't it make it a little bit easier to just focus on the parties and their interests and what means what means the most to them in, kind of coming towards an agreement than if you don't have to think about that variable of that universe of likely outcomes, does that make it a little bit easier?
Yeah, I think that a lot depends on your jurisdiction and how accommodating the court system is to mediation where you are, right? In New York, of course, not that accommodating. I believe it's more accommodating in California, for example, meaning that, there are deadlines, there are court dates, there's conference schedules, and the judges are under strict scrutiny about how fast they're moving the cases along. And there's no mediation off ramp to say, hey, you know what, we're going to take a pause here. And so that can put a lot of pressure on mediation, because one of the beautiful things about mediation as opposed to litigation is that the mediation can kind of sort of progress at its own speed, and a speed that makes sense for the parties. Now they may not agree, and they usually don't, Alex, as to what the right speed is. And so it might put that might be really uncomfortable for one person. So sometimes when you have the two things running in parallel, it can make sure that it kind of keeps going. At least there's somebody overseeing it, and that can be beneficial, but it also can be problematic. And to the extent that having lawyers in the room might make it more adversarial seeming, is that kind of what you're asking about also?
Yeah, because make it more adversarial. And then, of course, notwithstanding the, I guess, the fact that mediation, at least in Michigan, is private and confidential. So it's really not to be repeated outside of the mediation. There's still a fear that there may be information given or exchanged that people will try to, maybe use in a different way or get at it in a different, because about something.
Sure, you can't unring that bell.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So-
think that's the situation anytime people are in a conflict and they want someone to help them work through the conflict, which is there's a risk to saying things because other people, either the other party or the mediator, is going to hear it. There may be a risk that information would get out. So you have to balance that against the risk of if you don't have that information, you might not reach an agreement. And in any kind of conflict, whether it's a legal conflict or some other type of conflict, there's something that will happen or not happen if you don't reach an agreement. So, Bhatna and Watnas, they also apply to non-legal situations. So if we don't reach an agreement, maybe what's going to happen is our business that we're business partners on, and that's what our conflict is going to fall apart. That's what's going to motivate them to try and work through, understand each other and reach an agreement. So in almost any situation when you're in conflict, if you're trying to work through an agreement, you need the motivation to get there, to kind of have the energy to get you through it. And that motivation comes from what's going to happen if we don't reach an agreement. If it's like, nothing will be different and I don't really care, then you're probably not going to have much motivation to work through it. So we're actually trying to tap into that motivation when we're working with people. Why are you here? What's the reason why you want to do mediation? Why you want to continue it?
Okay, yeah. And I can see how these kind of overlap because I had a thought to talk about each separately, but they really kind of, conjoin with each other and kind of complement each other, right? So all of these 6 steps, because it sounds like I hear you proceeding by agreement, going beneath the problem and everything you're talking about, allowing tension, supporting autonomy and honoring a connection. So it's all, you pull pieces out. I mean, if you had to categorize, I suppose you could put certain facts and perhaps certain techniques under one, but for the most part, they're all, would you say they overlap, Katherine Miller?
Absolutely, they do. And, sometimes we'll be like, well, is it this concept or that concept? And it doesn't really matter. But Alex, it's really important to think about them each individually because each concept brings something really, really valuable. Like you were just mentioning proceeding by agreement. One of the things that we in the model believe is that the parties and the mediator and attorneys or anybody else who's involved need to structure the mediation in a way that everybody agrees to, that it's not just like sliding a MasterCard application across the desk, with a teeny tiny print, sign here. And that way, when we build the process together and everybody understands and agrees as to how we're going to work together, then everybody can feel safe. It creates a safe container for difficult conversations. And these are often very, very difficult and charged conversations. And so when everybody trusts that the process is going to work the way we agreed, and that's not just with words, it's with action, so that the mediator has to be careful to make sure that she does actually ask for permission and get permission from both parties as we're building this working relationship, because trust is really an important piece of being able to work through difficult conversations in a way that feels really inclusive of everybody's view.
And I guess my question is this something that can be done? I mean, usually in one mediation between a set of parties, or is there an average length of time it takes in a certain number of hours? Because it does seem it seems like it could be a little bit longer of a process, not, because there's so much to do in there to try to make sure that it's an effective process. So how would you speak to that? Do you think it kind of is a little bit protracted, but more effective? Or would you say it's equally as it can be done in the same time frame as something less in depth?
So I think part of it depends on the complexity of the situation. So if you have a very complex factual situation, just as if you did a mediation in a different style, one step is going to be making sure all the information is available. Sometimes that takes more than one meeting just to get everybody having all the information they need. But it could be it's not so complex. All the information is available, but the dynamics are really hot. Then you're going to be working on the dynamics. So I think that you can't say it's more or less than some other, model. My experience, though, is that if you're trying to pressure people, and maybe you're in a caucus model where you got people in different rooms, mediators going back and forth, kind of doling out information here and there and suggesting, well, if you don't do this, you might end up in court. Maybe you'd like to compromise a little here. That can take a long time too, because you're kind of doubling up on the information. Right?
Yeah.
So I say I have conversation with room A. Now I got to go repeat it to room B. So I've used this model in, a 3-hour session that's, a volunteer session at court where people come in, very limited time, don't know how much information they've developed, and we just use the principles to get as far as we can. I do a lot of family law mediation divorces, and that's usually a series of meetings with parties if they're alone, but with lawyers, it might be longer meetings. It could be the lawyers develop most information. We come in for a day and then that's it. So it's adaptable to the particular complexities and dynamics within that particular conflict.
And if I could add to that, just in terms of the length of time it takes, I think of it as going slow in order to go fast. It's really where are you spending your time? And so if you build this container and you build this trust and way of working together in the beginning, you take the time to do it. Then when you get into the real negotiation, it goes a lot faster, as opposed to not spending any time at the beginning and then spending a lot of time really stuck. Right. And so, like, if you think, all right, the best solution is compromise, right, then, which I don't think it necessarily is, right? So people say, well, it's only going to work in mediation if you're willing to compromise. I don't think that's really true. It's only going to work in mediation if you're willing to engage, right? And you're willing to share. But if you think, okay, well, the obvious answer is halfway between the two, then, if that's your approach to mediation, then this doesn't make sense. But if your idea is, you hope for something more than that, something that really allows people to perhaps get 100% of what they want, if we're really able to talk about it, then doesn't it make sense to create a way to talk about it so we can actually have that conversation and come to a resolution that makes a lot more sense? And so what I tell people is I'm going to take the time to do this in the beginning, and whether or not that's 15 minutes or 2 hours, it's because I want to make sure that when we get to talking about the substance of this dispute and the issues that are in front of us, we really have an effective, efficient way to do that.
Okay. Do you find yourself trying to educate the parties themselves on this model a little bit without actually being, as direct in terms of, labeling the things and holding class about it, but at least it kind of helping them understand why we're doing this way, or why this might be a little bit different than what they might understand or have thought about in terms of a mediation? I could see there being kind of a misconception, like, well, what is, is this something different than mediation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think it's really helpful to explain. Well, first of all, I'm curious what their expectations are. If they're coming to mediation, do they have an expectation as to what it was? Did they talk to a friend? Did they talk to their lawyer? Is their lawyer there with them saying, well, this is what it's going to be? Because, what they say about assumptions, Alex, is that, when you assume something, you make an ass out of you and me. So I am, to my husband's sometimes dismay, a really big believer in making the implicit explicit. If I'm thinking this and you're thinking that, let's have a conversation about what we're both thinking. So that's how I explain it to people, and I ask them what they're expecting, and then I kind of explain sort of some of the things we've talked about, the stages of and Katherine Connor's been talking about this, gathering this information, finding out what's important to everybody. And then once we've done that, then talking about options and comparing those options against what's possible and against what's important. And through that process of what's important and what's possible and what the options are, kind of coming to a resolution that makes sense. And then they're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that might kind of work and kind of look like. And now, a word from our partners.
Next Level Mediation Software is a mediator's best tool for advancing their online dispute resolution practice. It takes into account the psychological attitudes of the disputing parties and helps mediators find the key priorities to negotiate. Based on decision science and an easy-to-use interface, The Next Level Mediation platform can handle the most complex disputes. Register today at nextlevelmediation.com for your complimentary 30-day trial of the subscription service and enter the code ABA discount 20 for a 20% discount.
So you also talk about the loop of understanding, and this is something that I know you alluded to in the first episode, Katherine Connor, and I thought it was a little bit metaphysical. It made me think about almost like you needed to be a psychologist to quite master this, but the mediator often gives an opening statement, and then each party gives some information about the nature of the conflict. And then you hear sometimes the mediator will restate or recapitulate in some way what they heard, what their understanding and what they heard from each party. Mm-hmm. Is that similar to a loop of understanding, Katherine Connor?
Yeah, I mean, that is what we're asking the conflict professionals to do. Mm-hmm. I think the subtlety of it is that often what someone wants to do when they're repeating what someone heard is they've filtered it, and they might have pulled out either the particular pieces they think are relevant to the law, mm-hmm. or they had this idea that if I just reframe it a little bit, I'll move them closer to coming to an agreement at the end. And so they're trying to move them somewhere else. And what's important about the loop of understanding is when we say to someone, this is what I think that I heard you say, then we describe it. We're trying to describe it as if we're in their chair, that we're actually telling their story the way we heard them say it, not the story we hope they will adopt if we can just move them someplace else.
I see.
Or not just a story that's the relevant legal facts, which mm-hmm. is what happens, or not just a story about their feelings, mm-hmm. but their whole story just as it is now. And I think that's what we emphasize in our trainings. That's the part that's really hard, because it's so hard not to filter out, not to use our usual professional filters or to put our own little spin on the story because of what we think it might do in the future. And that's really hard to do.
So one thing about the loop of understanding is it's really a following thing. So you are saying, I'm going to try to summarize what each person said was important to them. And sometimes people, and I'm going to try to do that from my listening to them. So I'm going to try to, I always say to people, to our students, that looping happens through the heart, not through the head. Right. And so I'm landing myself in terms of the impact on them of their words. And sometimes they'll go on paragraph after paragraph and I can loop it in a sentence and they're like, well, you said that so much better than I did. And it's not true. They got a chance to process it. And I'm just observing where they're really coming from on it, where I felt it in my heart. Right. And so, that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is that neurologically, it turns out with brain research in recent years that there's a loop, an actual physiological loop that happens in the energy between people in their brains when people feel understood, right? And that there's a sort of coming together and a sense of connection that happens when that happens. And when you are able to loop all the parties in a conflict and they each of them feel heard and understood, let's go back to our first concept, then they actually, the energy in the room changes and the trust builds, even if it's just with you, but the other person is sitting there, right? And so, that's one thing that happens. And another thing is that it's true that people come in conflict, feel vulnerable on some facts, right? Or some circumstance, or something about them. They like, when I present my argument, I'm not going to necessarily emphasize this part, right? And so, as the mediator, though, you're trying to create a sense of, what's really going on. And when we talk about something called what we call the mutuality of vulnerability, so that each person is able to show a little of their vulnerability, whether or not it's external vulnerability or internal vulnerability, but a little bit at a time, so that so one person doesn't feel really open. For example, we're trying to find out what's important to somebody on a particular topic around an issue. We go back and forth, because if you say, okay, one person has 20 things that are important, and the other person goes, I don't know, I just want to get paid what I'm worth, or whatever. Like, then the person who who really put themselves out and like thought about all those things that were really underlying their view and what was important to them, it really feels vulnerable to the other person. And so even when we're talking about what the external facts are, or what's going on for the person, we want to make sure we do that in a way that isn't charged. So, but aren't you worried about this thing? Because if I were you, I'd be really worried about that thing. And because that could look really, really bad for you,
So do you find yourselves, Katherine, Connor, trying to be kind of stoic about facts then, or what you hear, because you don't want people to feel to kind of preview, or you don't want people to think that you're in some way showing any reaction to what they're saying? Does that help make things less charged, and do you discourage perhaps other parties from, of course they should be respectful, but I mean, it is normal to have certain reactions, but I could see that in some way kind of interrupting the process a bit, right? Just being a human and, maybe laughing or just being really showing some type of disgust, or, does that sometimes get in the way of what, I mean, in a perfect world, would we be as monotone and as stoic as possible? Or do you think how does that kind of affect things?
Actually, I would say kind of the opposite, which is,
okay.
but that's actually a very common assumption among people who are trying to, conflict professionals, mediators, which is, I need to be non-judgmental and sort of neutral and not, like flare things up by trying to, actually tamp down the emotions. This goes to our concept of allowing tension, which is we think actually emotions are in the room. If we tamp them down by trying to don't do that, don't make that face, or don't interrupt, with like this heavy hand, that it's just going to go underground. It's not going to go away. So actually, and this is my experience when working with people, is we allow the emotions in the room. Obviously it becomes destructive, people yelling at each other or worse. We're not going to go with that, but emotions are in the room. And when I'm looping someone, I'm actually trying to loop with that feeling of whatever emotion it is that I'm sensing from someone. So if they're very excited, I'm going to loop with more excitement in my tone of voice. If they are seeming quite sad, then I'm going to want to try and feel that inside of myself and then loop with that feeling. So my voice is going to be different. My body is going to be different. And so I really want people to feel like I get them on the inside as well as what they're telling about that facts, because that's how people feel like they're really heard. And then when they're heard, they can kind of relax and they don't have to hold so tightly on to their story. And so it may very well be that the other person is one person's talking, the other person may be having some reactions, like, things that show they may not agree with the other person. If it's not interfering, then, that's okay, because emotions are in the room. And I often talk to people about in the beginning, and as it comes up, is you need your emotions to make decisions. People who can't get in touch with their emotions, you actually can't make decisions, and we want you to make good decisions. So your emotions are going to be here, and we're going to acknowledge them and work with them.
So again, you said it's the opposite, in terms of you don't tamp down people's feelings, let it be, I hate to overuse the word organic, but let it be natural, but when the parties get, how do you assess when it's out of control, when it's maybe time to refocus people and bring the temperature down?
I think we all kind of know when that happens, although I think sometimes people might jump in sooner than it needs to be, because sometimes people are having a good conversation, even though it might be that we would start to feel uncomfortable with it. So I remember this one couple I was working with, and they were interrupting each other, and they were kind of sometimes saying, complaints about each other, and a little bit of calling each other names. And I was ready to step in, and ultimately I did. And I said, I'm not sure, is this something that's working for you? And they turned to me and goes, yeah, actually, this is how we talk, and we usually get somewhere. I'm like, okay, if it works for you. And what's interesting is then they kept going, and I started listening to them, and I realized even though initially it hadn't seemed like they were really listening to each other because they were talking on top of each other, as they went along, they were saying things that led me to know that they were really starting to understand the other person. And it was actually a very productive conversation.
Okay.
So, if it looks to me like it's becoming destructive, that people are, calling each other names, they're, turning away, their body language is saying this hurts or it's destructive, then I'm going to step in. And usually I found it most effective. I step in with a quiet voice. I might say their names, Alex, Katherine, because they're so into it. I could stop in like, stop it, but that then feels like I'm the one that's in charge. But if I just say quietly their names a few times, they kind of look at me like, am I really doing this? And then have the conversation about, is this something that is really helping you? Most of the time, very few couples like the one I told you about say, yes, it is. Usually are like, no, it's not. Are you going to do something about it? And then it's a conversation about, here's what I see going on. Here's the pattern of conflict I see between the two of you. Here's another way we could do it, which is you could each talk to me rather than right now having this conversation between the two of you in a way that's not working well. Let's have the conversation, each of you with me, but in the presence of the other. And then I'm going to be trying to understand you, which means I'm going to be looping them and trying to move it into a way where they can feel understood and possibly also be listening to the other person.
Would you say that that's similar to what your approach might be, Katherine Miller, if you're in a situation, a high conflict, where the disputants are in conflict and perhaps things have gone off the rails?
Yeah, and I could add though that sometimes what we do is we do something we call looping the dynamic, right? Which is to say, reflecting back to the people what we see is happening in the room. And oftentimes you'll see a repeating pattern, especially if you're dealing with a family or situation or a long-time employment situation or business partners where the people have a long-standing relationship. You'll start to observe that this pattern happens again and again. Someone feels disrespected, unappreciated, and they're off to the races. And so we can then we call it looping the dynamic because it's essentially in the same way we're looping what someone is saying is going on for them. We're sort of holding up a mirror to the parties in the room and saying, here's what I observe happening. Does that feel familiar to you? And it gives them a chance to kind of take a step back and go, yeah, that really does sound familiar, or that's not quite right. You didn't quite get it, but at least now we're changing our conversation from the what, the substance of the argument, to the how are we communicating with each other? And it's incredibly effective to help them take a step back and just observe themselves in the room, right? And kind of look down on it and say, wow, that is happening. And then, is this helpful? As Katherine Connor was saying, is this what you want to do in this moment? No, it's not. But would it make sense for us to try to find a different way to work together, right? To proceeding by agreement? What would that look like? Well, each of us would get a chance to speak, or whatever it is, right? And so that's another one of our techniques, is really making a distinction between the what of the substance of the conversation and how we're working together. When people get really hot, really like in passion and arguing, or they get really stuck, and they feel like they're really dug in, and they're at a word that we use in conflict resolution, I think a little too much, impasse. Then when we change our conversation to how we're working together and how it might be different, then we have an opportunity also to change things.
One of the things that people talk about is the power imbalance between the parties. How do you grapple with that? Because in some cases, one of the parties really does, especially if it's not a family or something like that, if it's maybe an employment context, and you're talking about someone who really does have the power to hire, fire, promote, demote, all of those things, to take actions that, and you're trying to disarm or somewhat work around that differential and make both people feel empowered and kind of understand how, I guess, certain power can be productive and certain can be destructive. How do you do that and still have people do all of these, concepts, or work through these concepts in this understanding-based approach?
I think one thing is to talk about it. right? And I think it's much more dangerous if it's left unsaid. It's the elephant in the room, but we're not talking about it. Alex, I just want to say there are some power imbalances that make mediation unsafe, or making certain kinds of mediation unsafe, and severe domestic violence and things like that. So I don't want to be like, oh, this is always fine, we can always just talk about it and everything is wonderful. That's not always true. But when it's something like that, it's like, it's the obvious thing. I recently had a meeting where one party brought up at the end of the meeting, right at the end, something that could feel really threatening to the other person. You say, and so you could sort of observe that, wow, I can imagine that feels really threatening to Sally, obviously not the person's name, and just sort of talk about what the impact of those things are, not in a judgmental way or in a way we're trying to get them to do anything, but just observing what happened in the room. And so in those situations where people come in with a power imbalance, like you're talking about an employee-employer situation, right? I think that it's really important in the beginning to talk about those kinds of things that are obvious, that you can see as the mediator. But then there are also things that come up in the mediation itself that might create a power imbalance that might not be so apparent. Like, for example, one person is extremely talkative and talks all the time, and the other person is very reticent and quiet and talks much less of the time. Are we allowing the person who's talking all the time to dictate how the process is going just because they're talking all the time? Or are we allowing the person who's not talking all the time to dictate how the process is going? Because that's a possibility too. What's happening in the room. And so you could say, as the mediator, I noticed that the way each of you interact with the mediation and how verbal you are in the room is not the same. And I'm curious about that, and I wonder how that impacts you. And that is something I am genuinely curious. And I think it's really, really important when you start to have these conversations as a neutral about what's going on, is to, rather than be telling them this is wrong, because as a mediator, you could be like, that bad talkative person, that person leaves no air in the room for anybody else. That person is a bully. That person is narcissist. That, all this kind of stuff that can happen in your head, or you just make a decision about something about that person that's generally not a good thing. But on the other hand, if you just say, if you can get yourself to a place of genuine curiosity, what's going on here? What is really going on here? And for them, and how is it landing on them? Because it really doesn't matter how it's landing on me. And that's a really interesting conversation. And a lot of times when I ask a question like that, I'm really surprised by the answer. And I think if I didn't come from a place of real curiosity about what was going on for them, then there would have been no room for that surprise.
So what do you see? I'll start off with Katherine Miller. So is there something, though, you think universally, though, is missing in most mediation trainings that the center captures?
I'm so happy you asked that question, Alex, because I do.
Okay.
I think that almost all mediation trainings have the structure of the mediation, whatever the model is, the pedagogical theories and ideas and maybe even, techniques that they're teaching the students. And they almost all allow for some role play where the participants in the programs get to try out the mediation in a simulated fact pattern, right? But one thing that I think that makes the center's training really different and unique is that we add a part about how the learning is landing on each participant personally, right? And so we really encourage people to think about how they're experiencing the training, and not just think about it, write about it, talk about it, have small groups about it, because it's a really important piece of all learning, is how it lands on the student, right? And how that person, especially an adult learner, is going to, what they're going to take away from it and how they're going to integrate it. Because if it's just an idea and you're just sort of thinking about the idea and it's just sort of in your prefrontal cortex as a new idea, it doesn't really take hold in you. And obviously the people, I think it's much more more important that people who take our training leave with a sense of how this is going to matter to them and what they're going to do with it professionally, personally, whatever, or both, ideally both, rather than that they remember exactly how to loop or exactly what our 6 concepts are, or, that you can always look up, right? You can see a video about that, but you can't see a video on how it landed on you. And we pay a lot of attention and take real care to make sure that each person is participating fully as a person in the program. And I think that makes it much more special than just another continuing education program.
Wow, you said that better than I could know. I mean, that really is a great way of putting something. I mean, I can't imagine, because every day when we're learning something, nobody thinks about how it lands on someone. They really don't, And I know that, yeah, I was about to say there isn't always time for that, but maybe there should be, though. What were your thoughts, Katherine Connor?
I agree with what Katherine said. And I think another piece that's quite different is how much emphasis we put on paying attention to what's happening inside of you and its impact when you're working with people through conflict. Because you're one of the people in the room, and your reactions, your judgments, your motivation, your reactions, they all have an impact on what's happening between you and where it goes. And so we spend a lot of time in trying to help people to start paying attention to that. And what do you do with it? And how do you work with people when you're having reactions? And how do your motivations and how you're working impact what's happening in the room? So we believe that that's so critical that we spend a good chunk of the training on it. And I actually haven't heard of other trainings where that's the case. A lot of it has to do with what's happening on the outside. What's the next step? What do we do at this stage? What are the words that we use? And we do all that, but there's this added part about what's happening inside of us.
And that's probably why I always think of this kind of a little bit more from a metaphysical, psychological standpoint. But you've assured me, Katherine Connor, and I guess Catherine Miller will too, that I don't need to be a psychologist or psychiatrist to get to understand and really appreciate, right, the depth of this model. Correct?
Alex, let me ask you this. Do you have friends?
I'd like to think I have a couple, yeah.
And you care about those people?
I do.
Right. And if they come to you and they go, Alex, I've got a really big problem. Can we talk about it? Would you talk about it with them?
I would.
You can do this.
Okay. I get it. Well, that's okay.
I was going to make it any more simple. Are you human?
Right. There you go. I love it. I love it. That's a great way to kind of end this. And it feels like I do. It does feel like we've just kind of had like a friendly conversation, right, about these kind of things. And you were laying out a model, but it really just feels like we were talking among friends. So, that human experience. So I'd like to thank you for joining me and for providing further insight on your model. I appreciate you speaking to the specific components of the model. And I understand that these aren't necessarily new concepts, but it's how they're presented and how they're packaged, right? All of them are. I did take that, of course, full disclosure, from the website, saying that everything isn't necessarily new, but it's how they're used creatively, right? And presenting them in a different way to achieve perhaps different and better outcomes. So thank you both, and I do appreciate your time today.
It's been so much fun.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure talking to you again.
Thank you for listening to Resolutions, a podcast about dispute resolution and prevention. If you enjoyed the episode and you'd like to help support our podcast, please share it with others, subscribe, or leave a rating and review. To stay up to date with all the latest info on dispute resolution, follow the ABA section of dispute resolution on LinkedIn and Twitter. Or for more information, other ABA dispute resolution programs and publications, including upcoming events, visit www.americanbar.org/dispute. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.